All right, everyone. So I'm sure we all have various films that we've seen that we love, like a lot. But there's always like the time you feel like the story is just about to get really good, and then the credits roll, and that is exactly what The Sword and the Stone does for me. So, The Sword and the Stone, I think a lot of people, when they see it, they just think, oh, it's Disney's version of the King Arthur myth. But it's actually based on a book called The Sword and the Stone, which is part of a series of books under the title of The Once and Future King, which is a more mature and kind of graphic retelling of the King Arthur myth, which has basically been the foundation for almost every single King Arthur interpretation that you've seen within film and within like the past century. But you wouldn't know that seeing Disney's The Sword and the Stone.
And I say we go back to the woods.
No, not on your life. That boy's got to have an education. He has a future.
Well, you may...
So the first book in the series, The Sword and the Stone, came out in 1938, followed up by a sequel that was kind of not really marketed as a sequel called The Queen of Air and Darkness. That was followed up by the third novel in 1940 called The Ill-Made Knight, and then it was concluded with the novel The Candle in the Wind, but it was published in 1958. So you have The Sword and the Stone in 1938, The Queen of Air and Darkness in 1939, The Ill-Made Knight in 1940, and The Candle in the Wind in 1958. Walt Disney got his hands on the rights to the first book's film rights. So the original time that Disney wanted to release the film was in 1944, just like a few years after his first animated feature, The Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And then it wasn't made, and then it would continue to be announced as being made and in production for the next decade and a half. And it was never in production. Then in 1960, they were developing two projects. At this point, they were doing one animated film every 4 years. So they were picking their projects very selectively. One was The Sword and the Stone, and the other one is called Chanticleer, which is based on a French poem. Everyone who wasn't a producer, basically, it seems like, everyone who wasn't a producer cared a lot about Chanticleer. So the designers of Chanticleer went to the producers and they shared their storyboarding, various pictures of the scenes, to the producers, and the room went silent, and someone in the back of the room said, "You can't make a personality out of a chicken." Of all the things to get like upset about, that's what he got upset about. They decide they're just going to go with The Sword and the Stone. But no one seems that interested in The Sword and the Stone. No one. Maybe there's some people, but every story I've read about it indicates that like the scriptwriter, the director, the animators, everyone was like, well, I guess we got to do this King Arthur story. And honestly, it shows. Like, a lot of the critics at the time, and even today, consistently kind of say that, like, okay, it's fun. It's it's a fun little adventure romp. It's exciting at times. It's a nice little taste of the origin for King Arthur, but it's just kind of aimless. So the novel, and this is what I think is super important. So the novel is all about Arthur before he's king. He lives with Sir Ector, his guardian, and his foster brother Kay. He loves both of them, He doesn't feel afraid of them. So anyway, Merlin comes along and turns Arthur into a few different kinds of animals to teach him lessons regarding those animals. In the book, it's very much like suddenly Arthur's an animal that he didn't expect to be, and he's just the animal. No one's around, there's no songs, there's no conversations. He's literally just a hawk or a fish. And then he just has to figure out what Merlin is trying to teach him through that circumstance. But then in the movie, they're like, no, okay, everyone, Merlin and Arthur, both turn into little animals, and they have a little fun adventure and a fun song. That's what's really happening. And then Arthur learns some valuable life lessons. The thing is that T.H. White, the author, wrote The Once and Future King directly to critique the mentalities that led to World War II. And he wanted to use Merlin as his voice to communicate these ideas, and he wanted Arthur to be kind of the lens through which the audience can engage with those ideas. And Disney just ignored all of that. They just took all of that out, and I don't know why they thought they should do that to begin with. At some point, Walt Disney also bought the film rights to The Ill-Made Knight, which is all about Sir Lancelot and his affair with Queen Guinevere, who's Arthur's wife. And I really don't understand why they thought this was a good idea. Like, basically, given the subject matter of these novels, and given the maturity level of these novels, it would be akin to Disney buying the rights to Game of Thrones today. It's baffling. It's baffling why they even bothered. Because it just doesn't fit Disney's MO. It doesn't fit Disney's stylistic choices and what the stories they try to tell. They don't necessarily veer entirely away from dark or mature subject matter, but it's always relegated to smaller story plot points, or it's not necessarily at the forefront of the film. And that is exactly what these novels are about. They're about Arthur facing death. It's about him coming to grips with and facing death in its face. About him coming to grips with the worst kind of evil. In the end, the Sword in the Stone movie is sort of fun. It's enjoyable. I still kind of love it. I still love aspects of it. The opening, the first 25 minutes of the film are just great. They just create this atmosphere of immense, weight. And then the end is actually really interesting too. Suddenly there's a jousting tournament, and Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone. And you're like, great, what's gonna happen next? And then the little end title comes up and the credits start rolling, and you're like, nothing's happening. Walt Disney really wanted to make this into a film, but he didn't have the people on board with his vision. No one else wanted to do it. Everyone else wanted to do the French film about the farm animals. And he forced it on to people who didn't want it. And maybe they should have waited longer. Maybe they should have let this thing lie low. Which is why I think potentially the news that they're actually going to make a live-action remake of this is interesting. This is one of the few projects that Disney's made in the entirety of things where there's so much potential and there's so much interesting concepts and characters, but the original execution just was kind of lacking, deeply lacking in some areas. And it's literally the only thing that they've announced for live-action remakes that I'm at all excited to hear about. Because my hope is that You get someone who's on the project who understands the material. They've read the book, and they care about the book. And they don't want to just throw the book away and do something completely different. They want to do stuff from the book. The problem is that the first book in the series is very much like kid-friendly, but the rest of them aren't. You can make The Sword and the Stone into a kid-friendly film. You can't do the same with The Queen of Air and Darkness, with The Ill-Made Knight, or with The Candle in the Wind. All of them are about death and, like, crazy stuff that just shouldn't be on kids' radar. And so I don't know what they're going to do. I really don't know. So if they make a movie and they make it the first chapter, what happens next? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. It's hard to trust the Disney company to do it justice. I don't know. And I think in particular this story really touches me, because this is The Once and Future King is one of my favorite novels I've ever read. It's powerful. It's heroic. It's got this mythic quality, but also feels very real. Like the characters feel like real people. And I highly recommend it. Like, if you haven't read The Once and Future King and you're into fantasy at all, if you're into Lord of the Rings, or if you're into Narnia, or you're into Game of Thrones, or whatever, and you haven't read The Once and Future King, then I think you're missing out on something that's very important to the genre, and something that's foundational to the Arthur myth that we have today, the way that it's been portrayed in film, in almost every single facet. So, yeah. So that's it. Sword in the Stone. Kind of a letdown. This is exciting, but I want to see more. Do you?